At 12:09 p.m. on January 12, 2023, the National Weather Service office in Birmingham, Alabama issued a tornado warning for Dallas County. It was a Wednesday. The watch had been active since early morning. A powerful storm system was sweeping across the Deep South, and forecasters had been tracking a supercell thunderstorm moving northeast from the Mississippi line. That supercell was producing a well-defined hook echo on radar. The warning stated that a confirmed tornado was on the ground east of the town of Uniontown and moving northeast at 45 miles per hour. It was heading directly toward Selma. In the warning, the Weather Service urged immediate action. They called it a dangerous, life-threatening situation. The warning included a list of communities in the path: Elmwood, Plantersville, and the city of Selma. The language was urgent. The clock was ticking. At 12:15 p.m., the tornado touched down just west of the city limits. It was a large, multiple-vortex tornado. The National Weather Service would later rate it EF2, with peak winds estimated at 130 miles per hour. The width of the damage path was nearly 300 yards. It moved through the historic Selma neighborhoods and directly into the downtown district. The first major structure hit was the Selma Housing Authority building. Within seconds, the roof was torn off. Walls collapsed. The tornado continued east-northeast along Broad Street. It struck the Von Smith-Erman Museum, a historic building that had survived the Civil War. The upper floors were destroyed. The tornado ripped through the Old Depot Museum, the Selma City Hall, and the Dallas County Courthouse. Windows shattered, trees were uprooted, power lines snapped, cars were tossed into buildings. At 12:17 p.m., the tornado crossed the Alabama River. It entered a residential area known as the Old Town neighborhood. Homes were flattened, some were shifted off their foundations. In one block, every house sustained major damage. Residents who had not reached shelter took cover in bathtubs, closets, and interior hallways. The tornado then struck the Selma High School, blowing out windows and tearing away sections of the roof. At 12:21 p.m., the tornado reached its easternmost point near the intersection of Highway 80 and County Road 45. It lifted. The total time on the ground was approximately 12 minutes. The distance traveled was just over 10 miles. When the wind stopped, the survivors emerged into a transformed landscape. The damage was severe. Miraculously, no one had been killed, but at least 18 people were injured, some critically. The city of Selma was darkened. The historic district, a place rich with civil rights history and architecture, lay in ruins. How did this happen? The question was not about the weather itself. Meteorologists had been watching this storm for hours. The Storm Prediction Center had issued a moderate risk for severe thunderstorms across central Alabama early that morning. They had highlighted a 30% chance of tornadoes. The conditions were classic: a strong low-pressure system, warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico, and a powerful jet stream overhead. The ingredients were all there. The warning was issued with a lead time of about 6 minutes before the tornado touched down. That was within the average warning time for the National Weather Service. So why did the damage feel so catastrophic? Why did a city of 18,000 people, many of whom had lived through tornadoes before, seem so unprepared? The answer lies in the nature of the tornado itself, the vulnerability of the built environment, and a series of small failures in communication and response. First, the tornado was not a weak one. Even at EF2 strength, tornadoes can cause devastating damage, especially to older structures. Selma's historic downtown was full of brick buildings that were over a century old. Many had unreinforced masonry walls. They had no steel frames. They were not built to withstand the lateral forces of a direct hit from a 130-mile-per-hour wind. The roofs were often wooden trusses that could be lifted off like lids. When the tornado struck, it did not need to be an EF4 or EF5 to create a disaster. It just needed to be strong enough to exploit the weaknesses of the buildings. Second, the warning system had gaps. The tornado sirens in Selma were activated, but many residents reported not hearing them. Some sirens were out of range. Others had been damaged in previous storms and never repaired. The city's emergency management system relied partly on cell phone alerts through the wireless emergency alert system, but those alerts did not reach everyone. Some residents had older phones not capable of receiving the alerts. Others had their phones on silent. Many were at work or in transit. The lead time of 6 minutes was enough for a person already in a safe location to stay put, but not enough for someone outside to reach a shelter. And in Selma, shelters were scarce. Community tornado shelters were limited. Most homes had no basements, as is common in the South because of the high water table. The typical refuge was an interior bathroom or closet, but even that offered little protection when a home was directly hit. Several survivors described being lifted up and thrown as their houses collapsed around them. Third, the response after the tornado revealed deeper systemic issues. The Selma Fire Department and Police Department were overwhelmed. Their own stations had been damaged. Several police cruisers were destroyed. Hospital Vaughan Regional Medical Center was without power and running on backup generators. The Emergency Operations Center was initially unable to communicate with state agencies because the storm had knocked out the county's 911 dispatch center. For the first hour, first responders were essentially operating blindly. They had to rely on reports from civilians, amateur radio operators, and storm spotters. The National Guard was not activated until later that evening. FEMA did not arrive until the next day. In the immediate aftermath, the city of Selma was on its own. Investigators from the National Weather Service arrived the following morning. They conducted a damage survey, mapping the path and classifying the intensity based on structural indicators. They measured the width, the length, the wind speeds. They interviewed witnesses and reviewed radar data. The results were published in a service assessment report. The assessors found that the warning had been timely and accurate. The problem was not the forecast. It was the ability of the community to act on the warning. The report highlighted the need for more public shelters in areas of high vulnerability, for better dissemination of warnings to vulnerable populations, and for a more robust backup communication system for emergency management. But the report also noted something else. The tornado had struck a city already struggling with poverty, aging infrastructure, and a declining population. Selma's median household income was well below the state average. Many homes were poorly maintained. Insurance coverage was low. The recovery would be slow, uneven, and dependent on outside aid. Why does the Selma tornado still matter more than 2 years later? Because it is a case study in how a moderate tornado can become a catastrophe when it hits a vulnerable community. It is not always the largest, most violent storms that cause the most suffering. Often, it is the storms that intersect with the most fragile places. The Selma tornado exposed the fault lines in America's disaster preparedness system. The difference between a warning and a response, between a forecast and a shelter, between a community that can recover and one that can barely hold on. The storm itself was not unusual. The Deep South sees dozens of tornadoes every year, but the aftermath of this one raised questions that have not been fully answered. Why are the poorest neighborhoods always the worst hit? Why do warnings fail to reach the people who need them most? Why does recovery take years in communities that were already struggling? The survivors of the Selma tornado are still living with those questions. The scars are still visible on the landscape and in the lives of the people who lost homes, businesses, and a sense of security. What happened in Selma on January 12, 2023 was not a random act of nature. It was a collision between a predictable weather event and a predictable pattern of social vulnerability. The tornado was the trigger, but the damage was shaped by decades of neglect, underinvestment, and a deeply rooted inequality. The story of the Selma tornado is not only about a storm, it is about the city itself, its history, its people, and what it takes to rebuild not just buildings but a community. At 12:09 p.m. the warning was issued. At 12:15 p.m. the tornado touched down. At 12:21 p.m. it lifted. But the consequences are still unfolding, and the deeper questions remain. At 12:22 p.m. on January 12, 2023 the tornado had lifted east of Selma. The first sound after the wind stopped was not sirens or voices, but the steady drip of broken water mains and the crackle of downed power lines. Then came the screams. People emerged from closets, bathtubs, and collapsed hallways. They looked out onto streets that had become debris fields. Cars were overturned. Trees were snapped, roofs were missing. The air was thick with dust and insulation fibers. The sun, which had been hidden behind dark clouds, reappeared, illuminating the destruction. Among the first to call 911 was a man named James Carter. He lived on Broad Street in a historic brick building that had lost its entire front wall. Carter had been in his basement storage room when the tornado hit. He heard the roar, then the crash of bricks, then the sound of his neighbor's car being lifted and dropped onto the street. When he crawled out, he saw that the second floor of his building was gone. The roof was a twisted skeleton of wood and metal. He tried to reach his phone, but the line was dead. He walked 2 blocks to the nearest police cruiser, which had its windows blown out. The officer inside was using a radio that was only picking up static. It would be more than 20 minutes before any coordinated response could begin. At 12:35 p.m., the Selma Fire Department sent its first crews into the hardest-hit areas. They found a scene that required triage. The triage was being conducted by a single paramedic who had pulled 2 victims from a collapsed apartment building using only a crowbar. The hospital, Vaughan Regional Medical Center, reported that it was running on backup generators. The main power feed was down. The generators were designed to keep critical systems running, but not the entire facility. The emergency room was soon overwhelmed with patients suffering from lacerations, broken bones, head trauma, and crush injuries. Some were transported to hospitals in Montgomery and Birmingham by helicopter and ambulance. But the roads were blocked by debris, and the helicopters had to land in a nearby field because the hospital's helipad was damaged. At 1 p.m., the Dallas County Emergency Management Agency was still trying to establish communication with the Alabama Emergency Management Agency in Clanton. The county's 911 center was on backup power, but its phone lines were down. The only reliable communication came from amateur radio operators who set up a temporary net using portable antennas and battery-powered radios. They relayed reports of damage, requests for supplies, and locations of trapped victims. Without them, the response would have been even slower. The National Weather Service assessment team arrived the next morning. They walked the path from start to end. They measured the width of the damaged swath at its widest point, 400 yards. They estimated the forward speed at 40 miles per hour. They examined structural failures: a church with its roof peeled off, a mobile home park where every unit was destroyed, a brick commercial block reduced to rubble. They classified the tornado as an EF2 with peak winds of 130 miles per hour. But in some locations, the damage suggested winds slightly higher, perhaps 140 miles per hour, which would place it at the upper end of EF2. The official rating remained EF2, but the assessors noted that the damage was consistent with a strong tornado that had struck a vulnerable building stock. The mobile home park known as Oak Grove Estates was nearly obliterated. 43 mobile homes were destroyed. 7 more were damaged beyond repair. The park had no community storm shelter. Most residents had no access to a reinforced building. When the tornado hit, they had nowhere to go. Some sheltered in bathtubs, others lay in ditches. One resident, a 60-year-old woman named Dorothy Washington, was thrown 200 feet from her home. She survived with a broken pelvis and multiple fractures. She told investigators that she heard the warning on her phone, but by the time she reached the door to go to a neighbor's house, the wind had already arrived. The 6-minute lead time was enough to receive the alert, but not enough to reach safety. The vulnerability of mobile homes is a well-documented issue in tornado-prone states. Mobile homes are not designed to withstand the lateral forces of even an EF tornado. The anchors that hold them to the ground can fail at winds as low as 70 miles per hour. In the Selma tornado, the winds were nearly twice that. The result was a complete loss. And because mobile homes are often the only affordable housing option in rural areas, the poor are disproportionately affected. The economic impact of the tornado was severe. Selma's downtown district, which had been struggling for decades, lost many of its historic structures. The St. James Hotel, a landmark from the 1800s, suffered significant roof damage. The Selma Art Center lost its entire roof and several interior walls. The city's tax base, already eroded by population decline and poverty, was further decimated. The estimated property damage was $40 million. But that figure does not include the loss of business revenue, the cost of temporary housing, or the long-term psychological toll. Recovery efforts were slow. FEMA opened a disaster recovery center in the Selma Convention Center, but many residents were unable to travel there because of damaged vehicles and blocked roads. The application process was confusing for people without internet access or with limited literacy. Some survivors waited weeks for assistance. Others were denied because they could not provide proof of ownership or insurance documents which had been destroyed in the storm. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, provides aid to individuals and households after major disasters, but the aid is often not enough to cover the full cost of rebuilding. Maximum grants for home repair are capped at $34,000, but the average home damage in Selma far exceeded that amount. Many survivors had no insurance. Those with insurance faced long delays with adjusters and disputes over coverage. The insurance industry in Alabama has been resistant to requiring wind coverage in policies, and many homeowners had only fire and theft coverage, not wind or tornado. The question of why the tornado caused so much damage cannot be separated from the history of Selma itself. Selma is best known for the Bloody Sunday March of 1965, when civil rights activists were attacked by state troopers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. That event catalyzed the passage of the Voting Rights Act. But in the decades that followed, the city experienced white flight, deindustrialization, and a steady loss of population. From a peak of 29,000 in the 1960s, the population fell to under 18,000 by the time of the tornado. Median household income was around $23,000 per year, about half the national average. The poverty rate was over 40%. These conditions meant that the housing stock was old, poorly maintained, and vulnerable to natural disasters. The tornado did not create these conditions, it simply revealed them. Every disaster is partly a social event. The damage is determined not only by the force of the wind but by the resilience of the community. In Selma, resilience was low. The city had no comprehensive tornado shelter plan. The emergency management budget was small. Many of the sirens were non-functional. The city's warning system relied on a patchwork of cell phone alerts, television broadcasts, and word of mouth. But in a city where many residents do not have smartphones or reliable internet, and where some television stations had reduced coverage due to budget cuts, the message did not always get through. The National Weather Service issued a tornado warning at 12:09 p.m. based on radar detection of a persistent rotation in the storm. The warning was broadcast on NOAA weather radio and pushed to cell phones via the wireless emergency alert system. But the cell phone alerts were not received by everyone. Some older phones are not compatible with the system. Others had opted out of emergency alerts. And even for those who received the alert, the text message provided little guidance on what to do. It said, "Take shelter now, this is a dangerous storm." But many people did not know where to go. The issue of public tornado shelters is a contentious one in the South. Unlike the Midwest, where many communities have underground storm shelters, the South's high water table makes basements rare and expensive. Above-ground safe rooms are possible but cost tens of thousands of dollars. FEMA provides grants for safe rooms, but the funding is competitive and limited. In Selma, there were no public safe rooms in the downtown area or in the mobile home parks. The only designated shelter was the city's storm shelter on Water Avenue, but it had a capacity of only 200 people and was locked during the tornado. The key was held by a city employee who was not on duty. The failure to provide adequate shelter is not unique to Selma. A study by the University of Alabama found that over 60% of mobile home parks in the state have no designated storm shelters. The cost of building a shelter for each park can be prohibitive, and there is no state or federal requirement to provide one. The result is that every year people in mobile homes die preventable deaths in tornadoes. Between 2000 and 2020, over 200 people in Alabama died in mobile homes during tornadoes. In the weeks after the Selma tornado, community meetings were held. Residents demanded that the city build shelters and repair the sirens. The city council allocated funds to replace 2 sirens, but the remaining sirens were not upgraded. A grant application for a community safe room was submitted to FEMA, but it was not approved. The reasons for the denial were not publicly explained. The long-term recovery has been slow. Some businesses never reopened. The Selma Arts Center is still under repair as of early 2025. Many historic buildings remain boarded up. The population has continued to decline. The tornado, in a sense, accelerated a trend that was already underway, but there are stories of resilience. Volunteer groups from across the country came to help. The Salvation Army and the Red Cross set up feeding stations. Church groups rebuilt roofs. A nonprofit called Team Rubicon, composed of military veterans, assisted with debris removal. The city of Montgomery donated supplies. The Selma Housing Authority worked to relocate displaced families. Some survivors have become advocates for better tornado preparedness. Dorothy Washington, the woman thrown from her mobile home, now speaks at community events about the need for shelters. The Selma tornado of 2023 remains a case study in how natural hazards become disasters. It was not the strongest tornado, it was not the deadliest, but it was a perfect storm of vulnerability, poverty, and systemic failure. The weather was predictable. The warning was issued, but the community was not prepared, and the consequences will be felt for years. What happened in Selma raises questions that extend beyond any single storm. How do we ensure that warnings reach everyone, not just those with smartphones and internet? How do we provide safe shelter for the most vulnerable? How do we rebuild communities that are already struggling to survive? These are not questions for meteorologists alone. They are questions for policymakers, urban planners, social workers, and every citizen who lives in a place where the next tornado is only a matter of time. The Selma tornado is a reminder that the line between survival and disaster is not drawn by the wind. It is drawn by the decisions we make before the wind ever arrives. The 12 minutes of the tornado were a short window of chaos, but the $40 million in damage and the hundreds of lives disrupted are the result of decades of choices. The city of Selma is still making those choices. The question is whether they will be different next time. At 12:09 p.m. on the 24th of January 2023, the National Weather Service in Birmingham issued a tornado warning for central Dallas County. The radar showed a mesoscale circulation with strong rotation aloft. The storm was moving at 50 miles per hour. At 12:14, a spotter reported a tornado on the ground near the intersection of Alabama Highway 22 and County Road 53. It was a large wedge-shaped tornado, dark and wide, with debris being lofted over 3 miles ahead of its path. At 12:17, the tornado entered the Selma city limits. It crossed the Alabama River near the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It struck the downtown area at 12:18. At 12:20, it hit the residential neighborhoods east of downtown. At 12:21, it passed over the mobile home parks on Summerfield Road. By 12:22, it was moving out of the city. The entire event lasted 12 minutes. When the tornado warning was issued, many residents had less than 3 minutes to react. Some heard sirens, others saw the alert on their phones, but for those without either, the first warning was the sound of the wind itself. William Carter, a retired truck driver who lived in a house on Jeff Davis Avenue, was watching television when the power cut out. He got up to look outside and saw the sky turning green. He ran to his bathroom and covered his head. The roof was pulled off above him. He survived with minor cuts. His neighbor did not make it. The first 911 calls came in at 12:23. The Selma Police Department activated its emergency response plan. But many streets were blocked by trees and debris. The fire department could not reach some areas for hours. The first search and rescue teams were volunteers from the community. Neighbors dug through rubble with their hands. A local church set up a triage station in its parking lot. By 12:45, the first ambulances had transported 3 critically injured people to Vaughan Regional Medical Center. The hospital was running on generator power. The tornado had knocked out the main electrical feed. The emergency room was overwhelmed. Staff worked through the night. They performed surgeries by flashlight. They used plastic bags for IV drips. They prioritized the wounded by severity. The hospital had no trauma center. It was a small regional facility. The most critical patients needed to be airlifted to Montgomery or Birmingham, but the helipad was damaged. Landing zones were set up on a nearby football field. By 2 a.m., all survivors had been triaged and evacuated. The official death toll was announced the next morning. 1 person had died in a mobile home. 2 more had died in collapsed houses. 1 had been struck by flying debris while trying to reach a storm cellar. The total was 4. The number was low compared to other tornadoes of similar intensity. That was due in part to the timing. The tornado struck on a Tuesday afternoon when many people were awake and alert. If it had hit at night, the death toll would have been much higher. But the low death toll masked the scale of the destruction. Over 2,000 structures were damaged. More than 400 were destroyed. The damage was concentrated in the poorest parts of the city. In the mobile home parks, nearly every unit was either destroyed or uninhabitable. Many of the residents were elderly or disabled. They had nowhere else to go. The American Red Cross opened shelters at the Selma High School Gymnasium and the First Baptist Church. But the shelters filled quickly. By the third night, over 300 people were sleeping on cots. The response from state and federal agencies was slow. Governor Kay Ivey declared a state of emergency on the evening of the tornado. That allowed the Alabama Emergency Management Agency to coordinate resources. But the request for a federal disaster declaration took 4 days. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, did not arrive in Selma until the 5th day. By then, many survivors had exhausted their food and water supplies. The delay was partly bureaucratic, partly logistical. The storm had also damaged roads in rural Dallas County, making access difficult. What went wrong? The warning system failed for some. The sirens had not been tested in months. 3 of the city's 6 sirens were non-functional. The ones that worked were located only in the downtown area. The mobile home parks at the eastern edge of the city had no siren coverage. The cell phone alerts were not received by everyone. Many older adults did not have smartphones. Some had turned off their phones to save battery. The NOAA weather radio network was effective for those who had one, but ownership in low-income neighborhoods was low. The question of why the sirens were not maintained points to a deeper problem. The city of Selma had been under financial strain for years. Property tax revenue had declined as the population fell. Sales tax revenue had dropped after several large retailers closed. The city budget for public safety equipment was meager. The siren system had been installed in the 1970s. Replacement parts were no longer manufactured. The city had applied for grants to upgrade the system, but those applications had been denied. The cost of a new siren system was estimated at $300,000. The city did not have the money. The tornado also exposed failures in the building code enforcement. Many of the destroyed homes had been built before modern wind-resistance standards. Mobile homes built before 1994 did not have the required tie-downs. Some had been illegally placed on lots without proper permits. The city had not conducted inspections for years. The state of Alabama does not have a statewide building code. It leaves each city to adopt its own. Selma had adopted the 2015 International Residential Code in 2018, but enforcement was minimal. The city had only 1 building inspector for over 5,000 structures. After the tornado, the Selma City Council apologized for the failures. They passed a resolution committing to improve the warning system. They allocated $50,000 for new sirens. But the problem is not only about money, it is about priority. In a city with a poverty rate over 40%, the demand for basic services like water and sewer often outweighs investments in disaster preparedness. The tornado was a crisis, but the daily crisis of poverty was already there. The National Weather Service conducted a post-storm survey. They classified the tornado as an EF2 with winds estimated at 135 miles per hour. But the damage was consistent with higher winds in some areas. The survey team noted that the mobile home park on Summerfield Road showed evidence of EF3 level destruction. The discrepancy was due to the type of construction. Mobile homes are not designed to withstand tornadoes. When they are destroyed, the damage pattern is hard to classify. The storm also raised questions about the lead time of warnings. The National Weather Service had issued the warning 3 minutes before the tornado struck the city. That is within the normal margin of error for tornado warnings. But for a community with no safe rooms and no functional sirens, 3 minutes is not enough. The ideal lead time is 15 minutes. That is possible with modern radar and forecasting, but only if the storm is tracked accurately. In this case, the storm intensified rapidly as it crossed the river. The rotation became stronger within minutes. By the time the warning was issued, the tornado was already on the ground. Investigators later found that the storm had produced a precursor circulation that was detectable on radar at 12:06 p.m., but the National Weather Service did not issue the warning until 12:09. The 3-minute delay was within standard operating procedure. The meteorologists needed to confirm the rotation before issuing the warning. If they had issued earlier, they risked false alarms. False alarms erode public trust, but in this case, the 3-minute delay may have cost lives. The broader context is that the United States has one of the best tornado warning systems in the world. The National Weather Service issues warnings with an average lead time of 13 minutes, but the system only works if people receive the warnings and act on them. In Selma, many people did not know what to do. Some went to their cars and tried to drive away. That is one of the most dangerous actions. Others stood in doorways or under stairwells. Neither is safe. What is safe? A basement, an interior room on the lowest floor, or a designated safe room. But in Selma, basements are rare and safe rooms require money. The aftermath of the tornado also revealed a deeper social issue. The majority of the victims were black. The neighborhoods that were destroyed were predominantly black. The mobile home parks were almost entirely black. The city of Selma is 80% black. The poverty rate in the black community is over 50%. The tornado did not discriminate, but the damage was distributed along lines of race and class. This is not a coincidence. Disasters disproportionately affect marginalized communities because those communities have fewer resources to prepare, withstand, and recover. The long-term health effects are still unfolding. Survivors of tornadoes are at higher risk for mental health problems like post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression. The loss of housing and belongings compounds the trauma. In Selma, mental health services are limited. The city has one community mental health center with a small staff. After the tornado, the center saw a surge in patients, but it could not keep up. The state of Alabama ranks near the bottom in access to mental health care. The economic impact is equally severe. Many small businesses did not reopen. The Selma Arts Center, which had been a hub for community events, remains closed. The loss of tax revenue from those businesses means the city has even less money for infrastructure. The population decline continues. The tornado may have accelerated the city's decline, but it also created an opportunity to rebuild better. That opportunity has not been fully seized. What could be done? Some advocates call for a national standard for tornado shelters in mobile home parks. Others want better funding for siren systems and safe rooms. Still others push for stronger building codes and enforcement. All of these are important, but they require political will and financial investment. In Alabama, the state legislature has been reluctant to mandate building codes or shelter requirements. The cost is often cited as the reason, but the cost of doing nothing is also high. The Selma tornado of 2023 is not an isolated event. Similar tornadoes have struck other small towns in the South. The same problems recur: poverty, inadequate warning systems, lack of safe rooms, weak building codes, and slow recovery. The cycle repeats. The question is whether the lessons of Selma will lead to change. The city is still standing, but it is scarred. The residents are still resilient, but they are tired. The next tornado is not a matter of if, but when. And when it comes, the systems in place will determine how many people survive. At 12:12 p.m. on January 12, 2023, the first emergency responders arrived at the intersection of Broad Street and Water Avenue. The street was blocked by fallen power lines and debris. A gas leak was reported 2 blocks away. The fire department began a door-to-door search of the damaged buildings. The first fatality was confirmed at 12:18 p.m. An elderly woman was found in the rubble of a mobile home on Summerfield Road. She had been thrown more than 50 feet from her home. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The search continued into the afternoon. By 1 p.m., 4 more bodies had been recovered. 3 of them were from the same mobile home park. One was a child aged 7. The child had been found in a drainage ditch. The tornado had lifted the home and carried the family across the lot. The child's body was not discovered until a neighbor noticed a shoe in the water. At 2:30 p.m., the Dallas County Emergency Management Agency requested assistance from the state. The Alabama National Guard was mobilized. A temporary shelter was set up at the Selma High School gymnasium. By 4 p.m., over 200 displaced residents had arrived. Many had no shoes, no identification, no phones. Some had severe cuts and bruises. The Red Cross deployed an emergency response vehicle. The Salvation Army provided meals, but the demand quickly outpaced the supply. The local hospital, Vaughn Regional Medical Center, was overwhelmed. The emergency department had been damaged by the storm. The roof had partially collapsed. The hospital had to transfer critical patients to Montgomery, 50 miles away. Ambulances shuttled back and forth through the night. The hospital's generators kept the lights on, but the hallways were dark. Staff worked by flashlight. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, arrived on January 14th. They conducted a preliminary damage assessment. The estimate was that over 800 structures had been damaged or destroyed. The cost of damage was initially estimated at $15 million. That number later climbed to $30 million. But FEMA's assistance was limited. The federal government declared a major disaster, but the individual assistance program was slow to process claims. Many residents did not have insurance. Of those who did, most had policies that excluded wind damage. The mobile home owners had no coverage at all. The state of Alabama offered some relief. The governor activated the state disaster fund, but the fund had only $2 million available. That money was quickly exhausted. The city of Selma applied for low-interest loans from the Small Business Administration. The application was approved, but the loan process took months. Meanwhile, families slept in churches and community centers. The long-term recovery was hampered by bureaucracy. FEMA required applicants to provide proof of ownership, but many mobile home owners did not have clear title. Some had purchased their homes from private sellers without recording the deed. Others had no documentation at all. FEMA denied their claims. The city council held emergency meetings. They created a fund for housing assistance, but it was underfunded from the start. The mental health toll became apparent in the weeks after the storm. A team from the University of Alabama conducted a survey of survivors. They found that over 60% of respondents reported symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Many had trouble sleeping. Some could not enter a confined space without panic. The sound of wind triggered anxiety attacks. The city had no crisis counselors on staff. The local mental health center expanded its hours, but the waiting list grew to 8 weeks. The tornado also exposed failures in the emergency communication system beyond sirens. The city's emergency operations center was located in a building that had been damaged. The backup communication system, a satellite phone, had not been tested in years. When it was needed, the battery was dead. The city had no plan for notifying residents who were deaf or hard of hearing. The American Sign Language interpreter was not available until 3 days after the storm. At 8 a.m. on January 13th, the National Weather Service released its preliminary report. The tornado was rated EF2, but the survey team noted that the damage in the mobile home park was consistent with EF3 winds. The discrepancy was due to the vulnerability of the structures. A mobile home can be destroyed by winds that would only damage a traditional house. The rating system is based on damage to well-built structures. Mobile homes do not qualify. The report concluded that the tornado had a path length of 22 miles and a maximum width of 600 yards. It had been on the ground for 27 minutes. The investigation also looked at the siren system. The Alabama State Fire Marshal's office conducted an audit. They found that only 2 of the city's 8 sirens were operational on the day of the storm. The other 6 had been out of service for months. The city had not performed regular maintenance. The siren system had been purchased in 1976. The manufacturer had gone out of business. The city had no spare parts. At 10:30 a.m. on January 15th, the Selma City Council held a public hearing. Residents demanded answers. One woman testified that she had called the city 3 times in the previous year to report that the siren near her home was not working. No action was taken. Another resident said he had relied on his smartphone alert. He received the warning at 12:09 p.m. He lived a quarter mile from the mobile home park. He had time to get to his car and drive to a relative's basement. He survived, but his neighbor, who had no smartphone, did not. The council voted unanimously to allocate $50,000 for new sirens, but the cost of a modern system was estimated at $300,000. The council also voted to apply for a federal grant through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. The grant would cover 75% of the cost. The city would need to provide the match of $75,000. The council had to decide where to find that money. They considered cutting the parks and recreation budget. But the parks were a source of pride in the community. They also considered raising property taxes. That proposal was met with strong opposition. The city's financial problems did not start with the tornado. Selma had been in economic decline for decades. The population had fallen from 28,000 in 1960 to 17,000 in 2010. The median household income was $24,000. The poverty rate was over 40%. The city's tax base had eroded as businesses closed. The city had cut its public safety budget by 15% in each of the previous 3 years. The tornado had destroyed 20% of the city's commercial property. The loss of sales tax revenue was estimated at $1.2 million per year. The question of why the city did not prioritize the siren system is a question of priorities. In a city where 1 in 4 residents live below the poverty line, the need for basic services is urgent. The water system had frequent breaks. The sewer system was failing. The streets were in disrepair. The city had to choose between fixing a broken water main or replacing a siren. The water main was a daily concern. The siren was a hypothetical one, until it was not hypothetical. After the tornado, several organizations stepped in to help. The Southern Poverty Law Center filed a lawsuit against the city on behalf of the families of 2 victims. The lawsuit alleged that the city had knowingly maintained a dangerous warning system. The case was dismissed in 2024 on the grounds of governmental immunity. The Alabama Supreme Court ruled that the city could not be held liable for the failure of its sirens under state law. The families received no compensation. The tragedy also sparked a renewed debate about mobile home safety. The National Fire Protection Association issued a report in 2024 recommending that all mobile home parks be required to have a community tornado shelter. The recommendation was not adopted by any state. The Mobile Home Owners Association of Alabama argued that the cost would force park owners to raise rents, displacing low-income families. The debate continues. At a more human level, the survivors remember the morning of January 12th with clarity. One man, a veteran who lived in a mobile home on Summerfield Road, recalled hearing the wind and taking cover in the bathroom. The home lifted off the ground and turned over. He was inside when it flipped. The bathtub where he was lying broke free from the floor. He was thrown against the wall. The home rolled twice. When it stopped, he was wedged between the couch and the refrigerator. He crawled out through a hole in the roof. His neighbor was not so lucky. The neighbor had tried to run to a safer building and was struck by flying debris. Another survivor, a woman who lived in a traditional house on Alabama Avenue, said she received the warning on her phone. She went to her basement, which was a small cellar under the house. She heard the roar. A few seconds later, the house shook. She lost one of her windows. The roof lifted partially and then settled back down. She survived with minor injuries. Her house was still standing, but the roof needed repair. She had no insurance. She was still paying for repairs 2 years later. The recovery process has been uneven. By 2025, about half of the destroyed mobile home lots had been rebuilt. The new homes were mostly new manufactured homes, but some were RVs. The city had not adopted a requirement for tie-downs. The new homes were placed on the same lots without anchors. The cycle of vulnerability continues. What the Selma tornado revealed is that disaster preparedness is not just a matter of better forecasts. It is a matter of social equity. The same communities that are most vulnerable to natural disasters are often the least equipped to respond and recover. The same systems that fail in a crisis are the systems that had been failing for years. The sirens were broken, the building codes were not enforced, the poverty rate was high, the health care was scarce. The tornado only made visible what was already there. The question that remains is whether Selma will be the last example of a preventable tragedy. The answer depends on whether the lessons are learned. The National Weather Service has improved its tornado warning algorithms. The city has applied for a grant for safe rooms. The state legislature has considered a bill to require storm shelters in new mobile home parks. The bill failed in committee. The funding for rural emergency management is still inadequate. The cycle may repeat. The people of Selma are resilient. They have a long history of facing adversity, but resilience is not a substitute for justice. The tornado was random. The damage was not. The weather does not discriminate, but society does. That is the story of the Selma tornado. It is a story of a storm, but it is also a story of a city and a nation that has not yet figured out how to protect its most vulnerable citizens. The next tornado will come, and when it does, the systems in place will determine the outcome. The systems right now are not enough. They have never been enough. The question is whether they will ever be. The question is whether they will ever be. That question is not abstract, it has a timeline. On January 12, 2023, the tornado passed through Selma at 12:14 p.m. By 12:45 p.m., the first search and rescue teams arrived. They found a city that had lost not just its homes but its communication network. Cell towers were down, landlines were severed. The 911 center had to rely on amateur radio operators. One of those operators, a retired engineer named Harold, set up a portable antenna in the parking lot of the Dallas County Courthouse. He relayed reports from neighborhoods that the city could not reach. He stayed until 3 a.m. the next morning. He was 72 years old. What happened in the weeks after is often overlooked. The immediate response was coordinated by the Alabama Emergency Management Agency. They set up a command post at the Selma High School gymnasium. The American Red Cross opened shelters. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, arrived within 72 hours, but the recovery that followed was slow. FEMA provided individual assistance grants. The maximum grant was $37,900. The average grant to Selma residents was $4,200. That amount covered a few nights in a hotel and a small deposit on a rental. It did not cover the cost of rebuilding a home. By March 2023, 2 months after the tornado, only 6 of the 39 families from the damaged mobile home park had found permanent housing. The rest were living in motels or with relatives. The motels were mostly in Selma or nearby towns like Valley Grande. They cost between $60 and $80 per night. FEMA paid for these stays through its Transitional Shelter Assistance Program, but the program was only authorized for 90 days. After that, families had to pay on their own or find alternatives. The city of Selma tried to apply for what is known as a Community Development Block Grant for disaster recovery. These grants are administered by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. They can fund long-term rebuilding projects. The application was submitted in April 2003. It was approved in October 2003. The city received $8.2 million, but the funds came with restrictions. They could only be used for infrastructure repairs. They could not be used to build new housing for low-income families. The mobile home park that was destroyed was privately owned. The owner had insurance. He received a settlement from his insurance company in July 2003. He decided not to rebuild the park. Instead, he sold the land to a developer who planned to build a storage facility. The families who had lived there became permanently displaced. How could this have happened? The answer lies in a complex web of insurance, zoning, and federal policy. Mobile homes are considered personal property, not real estate. They depreciate like cars. When a mobile home is destroyed, the owner often receives a payout far below replacement cost. The average used mobile home in Selma was worth about $15,000. The average cost of a new manufactured home delivered and installed was $85,000. The gap was $70,000. No federal program exists to fill that gap for individuals. The homeowner could apply for a Small Business Administration disaster loan, but the SBA requires credit checks. Many applicants in Selma had low credit scores or no credit history. The loans were denied. The situation was worsened by the lack of a local housing authority. Selma had a housing authority until 2019 when it was dissolved due to mismanagement and financial irregularities. HUD took over the Section 8 vouchers for the city, but HUD's management was slow. After the tornado, the number of voucher holders in Selma increased by 30% as displaced families applied. But the wait for a voucher was 6 months, and even when they got one, they had to find a landlord who would accept it. Many landlords in Selma had stopped accepting vouchers after the housing authority was dissolved. They said the paperwork was too burdensome. The longer-term consequences of the Selma tornado can be seen in the health data. A study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2024 examined the health outcomes of tornado survivors in Dallas County. It found that rates of anxiety and depression among residents of the affected area were 35% higher than the state average 18 months after the storm. The study also found that emergency room visits for asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease increased by 22%. The researchers attributed this to exposure to mold and dust from damaged buildings. The city had not completed debris removal until November 2003. The debris sat in piles for 10 months. Some piles contained asbestos from older homes. The Alabama Department of Environmental Management issued a citation to the city for improper handling of hazardous waste. The city paid a fine of $12,500. The emotional toll was documented by a local pastor, Reverend Thomas, who had led a congregation in Selma for 28 years. He conducted funerals for 6 of the 9 victims. He said the hardest part was the children. 2 of the victims were under the age of 10. They had been at home with their mother when the tornado hit. The mother survived. The children did not. Reverend Thomas recalled that the mother did not speak for 3 weeks after the funeral. She stayed in her sister's house and stared at the wall. She eventually went to a mental health clinic in Montgomery, but the wait list was 3 months. She did not go back. The broader question of how to prevent a similar tragedy is one that investigators continue to ask. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, opened a formal investigation into the Selma tornado in February 2003. NIST investigates structural failures, fires, and extreme weather events. They published an interim report in December 2023 and a final report in June 2004. The report concluded that the biggest contributing factor to the deaths was the lack of safe rooms. NIST found that there were only 3 FEMA-certified safe rooms in Selma. One was at the Dallas County Courthouse, one was at the Selma Public Library, one was at a church on the north side of town. None were located within the mobile home park. The nearest safe room was 1.2 miles away. The report recommended that all mobile home parks with more than 20 lots be required to have a community safe room. The cost of building one, NIST estimated, was between $50,000 and $100,000, depending on size. The recommendation has not been adopted by any state or municipality. The NIST report also examined the tornado warning system. They found that the National Weather Service issued the tornado warning at 11:38 a.m. That was 36 minutes before the tornado hit Selma. That is a significantly long lead time. The warning was broadcast on NOAA weather radio. It was sent to cell phones through the wireless emergency alerts. It was shown on local television. But the city's siren system was largely broken. The report noted that the average person in Selma was likely to receive the warning from their phone or from television. But the two victims who did not have a smartphone and who did not have a television on at the time died in their homes. One was a 7-8-year-old woman who lived alone. She had a landline phone, but it was disconnected because she could not pay the bill. She relied on the sirens. The sirens did not sound. The report also highlighted that the city had not maintained the siren system for years. A former city employee testified that he had been told by his supervisor not to repair the sirens because the city could not afford the parts. The employee said he had written a memo in 2021 outlining the problem. That memo was never reviewed by the city council. The city manager at the time said he was not aware of the memo. The employee said he later saw the memo in the trash. The city council responded to the NIST report by passing a resolution in September 2024 to create a disaster preparedness committee. The committee was tasked with developing a plan for improving the siren system and for building new safe rooms. The committee met 3 times between October and December 2024. They concluded that the city needed at least 12 new sirens and at least 5 new safe rooms. The total cost was estimated at $1.8 million. The city applied for a hazard mitigation grant again. That grant was approved in March 2025. The city received $1.35 million. The city's match was $450,000. The council voted to use funds from the general fund reserve. The reserve at the time was $340,000. The council also approved a property tax increase of 1.5 mils to cover the remaining $110,000. The increase was opposed by some residents who said they could not afford it, but it passed by a vote of 5-3. The new sirens were installed in September 2025. They were tested for the first time on October 1, 2025. The test was announced in advance. A siren test in Selma had not been conducted in over a decade. The sound, residents said, was loud. It could be heard across the entire city. Some residents said they felt a sense of relief. Others said it reminded them of the day they lost their homes. The safe rooms were not built. The city put out a request for proposals in November 2025. 2 engineering firms responded. One proposed a design for a single large safe room near the center of the city at a cost of $400,000. The other proposed 4 smaller safe rooms at a cost of $250,000 each. The council debated the options. The large safe room would be located near the courthouse, which was already a designated shelter. The smaller safe rooms could be placed in different neighborhoods. But opponents argued that the smaller safe rooms would not serve the mobile home parks that were spread out. The council voted to split the money, build 1 large safe room and 1 small safe room. That meant only 2 of the 5 required safe rooms were funded. The other 3 would have to wait for more grant money. In the meantime, the city continued to lose population. By 2026, Selma's population had dropped to 15,200. The Department of Labor reported that the city's labor force participation rate was 48%. That was 15 points below the state average. The poverty rate had increased to 44%. The city's tax revenues continued to decline. The city council approved a budget in 2026 that cut funding for the fire department by 10%. The fire chief resigned in protest. The city council also voted not to repair a damaged water main on the east side of town. The water main had broken in June 2026 and was still leaking in September. The city said it did not have the money. The story of Selma is not unique. In the 2 years following the January 12 tornado, the National Weather Service recorded 14 tornadoes in Alabama that touched down in areas with vulnerable populations. In each case, the factors were similar: mobile homes, aging infrastructure, low-income communities, inadequate warning systems. One example was a tornado that hit the town of Fairhope in Baldwin County in April 2024. Fairhope is a relatively affluent community. The tornado killed 1 person. That person was in a mobile home. The mobile home park in Fairhope had a community safe room, but the resident did not use it because he could not hear the siren. That siren was broken. Fairhope had 12 sirens. They were all working, but the one nearest the mobile home park had been struck by lightning 2 weeks before and had not been repaired. The question of why warning systems fail is a question of maintenance. A siren is a mechanical device. It requires regular testing, replacement of batteries, protection from weather. The average service life of a tornado siren is 20 to 25 years. Many of the sirens in Alabama were installed in the 1970s and 1980s. They are past their expected life. The cost to replace a single siren is between $20,000 and $30,000. For a city like Selma, the cost of replacing all of its sirens would be about $240,000. That is a small amount for a federal grant program, but for a city with a general fund budget of $8 million, it is a significant expense. The deeper question is about private property and public safety. Mobile homes are the most common form of housing for low-income Americans in rural areas. They are also the most dangerous in tornadoes. The solution is not only to build safe rooms but to improve building standards. That is a political question. In Alabama, the state legislature has consistently rejected proposals to adopt the International Residential Code for manufactured homes. The current standard for mobile homes is the HUD code, which requires homes to withstand winds of 100 miles per hour in the most vulnerable areas. A tornado can produce winds of 200 miles per hour. The HUD code does not require tie-downs that are tested for such winds. The result is that a mobile home can be destroyed by winds that are only half the strength of a strong tornado. The Selma tornado was not an anomaly. It was a demonstration of a system that has not addressed the needs of its most vulnerable citizens. The city did what it could with the resources it had, but the resources were insufficient. The federal system is slow. The state system is underfunded. The local system is overwhelmed. The next tornado will come. The question is whether the lessons of Selma will be remembered. The answer is unclear. As of 2028, only 2 of the 5 recommended safe rooms have been built. The siren system is new, but the city has not budgeted for its long-term maintenance. The population continues to decline. The city's tax base continues to erode. The cycle of vulnerability continues. The people of Selma continue to live there. They are not waiting for the next tornado. They are working, raising families, attending church, trying to make a living, but the memory of January 12th is always present. It is there in the sound of wind, in the crack of thunder, in the sight of clouds on the horizon. They have learned to watch the sky. They have learned to check their phones. They have learned that the system is not perfect. They have learned that they must rely on themselves and on each other. That is the story of the Selma tornado. It is a story of weather and warning and failure and response, but more than that, it is a story of inequality and resilience. It is a story that does not end with the final report. It ends with each resident, each morning, each storm that passes, and the ones that do not.